Kawasaki, synonymous with awesome road bikes. The GPZ Kawasaki series. 1986 GPZ900R, 900 cc's of raw power. The famous double overhead cam 16 valve drivetrain. When it was in one of its original colours, the GPZ series was known as the Red Rocket. As good as it looks, this one has one problem. It just won't start. So, will this be a simple or a complex fix? Who knows? Let's find out. Okay, so it's not starting. Where do I start? That's the point. It could be a million and one things. Is it the starter motor that's faulty? Is it a blown fuse? Is it an ignition switch? Is it the starter button? The relay? The solenoid? The list goes on and on and on. But one quick way that I can decide which side of the circuit it is by this fella here. This is called the solenoid. So what this does is this actually supplies power from my battery over this side. It gets energized, it's just a coil, and then the power goes over to this side to start my starter motor. So how is that going to help me find the fault? Well, let's have a think about it. If all this thing does is put power from this side to this side, why can't I bypass it? Why can't I imitate that to see if it's a starter fault or if it's a control circuit fault? So that's what I'll do next. So just be aware now that this is now live power, so you don't want to short it out against your frame or anything like that. And yes, the wire is quite thin in comparison to what I really need. But the point is, I'm not actually trying to start the bike. All I'm trying to do is see if the starter motor will engage. So all I'm trying to do is bypass this part to this part, and it's quite easy. Watch this. Okay, so what does that tell me? It tells me that the starter motor is in good condition. Perhaps it may actually be in the coil in the solenoid. We'll look at that shortly. But where it must exist is in this control circuit, the one that goes back to the button. So we have power on one side and we have an earth on the other side, which energizes the coil here, which pulls on the solenoid to pull up a bar, I guess you could say, or a switch that closes this point to this point. So it's from this area back that way to the key and to the starter button. So for all my 12 volt needs that I'll use for this particular vehicle, instead of pulling off the tank, seat and everything else to access the 12 volts, I'm just going to use this 12 volt battery. It's a sealed lead acid battery. It was taken from the tip, but it still has good charge in it. So that's what I'll be firing up this little solenoid, the coil, to see if that's in good condition or not. So as you can see, I've pulled off the terminal, the original terminal. I'm now going to check the coil in the solenoid itself to see if there's an issue there. I could do a resistance check, but that doesn't necessarily put load on it. So I want to make sure that it's working under load. So all it is a coil of wire, like I said before. So we have a coil coming from, or a piece of wire coming from here going down there, and it comes out that side. So in actual fact, it really doesn't matter if you disconnect your wiring, whether you put positive and negative this side or positive and negative the other side. It really doesn't matter. Just be aware that I now have live power from my battery, so I don't want to short anything out. I just want to touch this. And what do you hear? You hear the starter motor engaging. So what does that tell you? Well, it now tells me that I've isolated another area that's in good condition. The best thing to do when trying to figure out wiring situations or wiring faults, electrical faults that is to find out what is actually working rather than what is not working. So I know that my starter motor is working. I know that this bar contact that goes across here on my solenoid is in good condition. I also know that the coil in here is working okay. I also know that the solenoid is being energized. No need to worry about this area. I need to start backtracking from this point back to my starter switch and ignition switch. Just to explain things a little clearer to you, what I'm going to do is draw a little schematic or a wiring diagram. In this case, I'm going to do what's called a pictorial wiring diagram. So in other words, I'm going to draw you a picture. So let's just have a look. Let's put in a power source. You always need a power source, don't you? So in this particular case we have a positive and we have a negative on our battery there, don't we? We also need power to go down to our solenoid assembly, don't we? So we'll draw that in. Of course that'll probably go through a series of switches. For instance, your ignition switch, your starter switch. Then that in turn will go to your solenoid. So let's just draw in that little solenoid that we saw in there. So that will be a copper coil, copper wire coil as mentioned, and that in turn will have to come up to an earth, and that was that black wire that we saw. We will need what's called a soft iron core. So anyone that knows me knows I always go on about a soft iron core. That's necessary to create an electromagnet, and in this particular case we're creating a solenoid. So let's just draw that in. So that'll be our soft iron core there, and that will move when the coil itself is actuated. Another thing we need, of course, is our starter motor. We'll put in a starter motor over here. Excuse the crudeness of my drawing, and it's not drawn to scale. So we'll just make that a starter motor, okay? And we'll put that as SM. Another thing we need, of course, is power to go to the starter motor itself. Now this is the purpose of the solenoid, so that it can allow a large amount of current to go through to the starter motor. So what we will have a contact point that will be pulled down like a bar, that will be pulled down onto the solenoid, and these in turn will be big thick wires. Of course we see those, don't we? Hopefully that's still in frame. That comes down to our solenoid there, and on the other side of our solenoid, this will go to our starter motor, a big thick wire that goes down to our starter motor. On the other side of our starter motor, of course, we need an earth, don't we? Which in turn will be another big thick wire. We also need an earth on our battery, don't we? Almost forgot that little fella there. There's our earth onto our battery. Any sort of circuit requires three things. It requires a power source, it requires a load, and it also requires an earth. So if we look at that very simply, we have our starter motor, which has an earth, it has a load, the motor itself, and it has a positive. If we look at our coil system here, our solenoid, it has a positive coming through here. The load itself is actually the winding, and of course then the earth is supplied there. How is this helping us with our quacker? What we can be assured of now is that we have this side of things working okay. We know that the starter motor is okay. We know that the solenoid is okay. Therefore the fault must exist in this particular area over here, our control side of things, mustn't it? So that there is where the problem exists. This is where we have a problem. While I've already stated that I'm happy with the solenoid operation, I will recommend to the customer that we tidy up these contact points. As you can see, there's quite a bit of rust and corrosion there. If it isn't playing up right now, it's obviously not an issue right now, but sooner or later it's going to play up. Those points in particular here and over here and perhaps even here will need to be cleaned up. This black wire would be an earth wire, so I need to prove its integrity. So by putting my multimeter on ohms, as you can see there, and putting my earth lead on a good known earth point, which is just up the top here. And now if I probe that black wire, I should have good continuity. As you can see, I have. That's almost spot on 0 ohms. So what I need to do now is find out if this fella here is going to produce voltage. So I'll go to DC volts. I've actually back probed the positive wire here, and I'm going to press the button now. I'll press the button, and what sort of voltage do we have? Well, there's what's called ghost voltage, which means that there's no voltage at all. So obviously there's a wire issue between my starter button and my solenoid wire here. The customer has told me that he's replaced the starter switch assembly, which includes the on-off switch as well as the starter switch, and not sure what that one is, can't quite see at the moment. But since he's done that, he said it hasn't worked properly either. Now, as I've had a look around, see if you can see the fault that I've found. Can you see what I see? Can you see that at least one of these wires is loose? You see that brown one, for instance? Check that out. So there's an orange one, there's a brown one, and look at this. Look at this one here. It's actually coming out of the socket, and this brown one looks like it's half out the socket as well. So could this be the issue? Well, remember that it was a yellow-red wire that goes down to our solenoid, so I'll need to check that next. Although that being here, that's my yellow-red wire that I need to check and make sure that that is actually the wire going down to my solenoid. Here is my connector. It comes from my wiring, my main wiring loom from my switch. Does a bit of a loop. This yellow-red wire is the one that I believe is correct. Now if I just back probe that, I should have continuity on my multimeter, because I've got it connected into the yellow-red wire down at the solenoid, and I've got no reading. OL stands for out of limits. So remember these wires that were falling out the back of the connector before? I thought before they fall out and I lose their position, I really need to stick them back in. So I disconnected this green connector, but at the same time, without any help from me, this connector fell to bits. Which connector is this? Hello, there it is, the yellow-red wire. So what I need to do is put these back into place, make sure that they stay in there, and then check and see if I've got continuity from this point down to my solenoid. Who knows, it might be something as simple as a bad connection. That can now get connected back into place. Everywhere I go on this bike there seems to be loose connections or wires that aren't right. I've noticed that some of the wires don't seem to match up. These change colour halfway through, so I'll have to refer to my wiring diagram to figure out what belongs where. The situation is not improving. If we zoom in here to have a look at this particular connector here, can you see what? Notice it's all green, so I'm expecting when I pull that connector apart that there will in fact be heaps of corrosion behind there. Yep, sure enough, there's corrosion. So and I'm sure in the female side of things of the connector, which is this section here, yep, you can see corrosion there as well. After cleaning up some of those connectors, refitting the terminals correctly and making sure that they were secure, I'd like to test now and make sure or see if I have voltage at my solenoid. So as you can see over here, I'm using my battery earth now, and if I just zoom down there, you can see that I've back probed my positive wire going onto my solenoid at the moment. So I've got my multimeter hooked up now onto the voltage range, as you can see, and when I press, I've got the ignition turned on, and when I press my start button, what am I getting? Well, I'm getting battery voltage, which is exactly what should happen, shouldn't it? I've already stated how many bad connections there are on this bike, and the main one that we're having trouble with is this one here. This yellow-red wire actually goes into a black wire, which obviously goes through a switch or something, and then goes back into our solenoid downstairs. I put all the tank back on, the seat back on, just about to take it for a road test, and then it stopped again. We're back under the tank now, where the wiring loom exists, and this is our yellow-red wire that we've been chasing that's meant to go down to the solenoid. But as you can see on this side, it changes into a black wire. Yay! Now all the wiring schematics that I have don't line up with that, so it's a bit of a hit and miss affair. So what I've been able to do is trace it, and we can go right down to here to our junction box, or our fuse box. As you can see here, I've pulled that off, and that is in fact this wire here. So that's the black wire that we're looking for. But this poor old bike's had some rough times. You can see over here, this is one of our main power feeds, and someone's either probed it, or maybe they've used a Scotch lock on it or something along those lines. I tell you what, it's just pretty damn ugly in my opinion. Have a look at that. So you can see they've I'd say it's a Scotch lock in my opinion, from what I can see. But yeah, that just creates problems. I'll have to tape that up. but I need to look for a continuity problem between that yellow-red wire at the headstock down to there's a relay on these. There's the starter relay right there on our fuse box. So that's the one that I need to find out where there's a continuity problem between there and across to my headstock. And I'm testing between the relay and the solenoid here. So you should expect, you know, if it's just a straight wire, you should expect about less than 1 ohm. But in actual fact, check out what the meter says. It's 8.9 ohms. So that's clearly miles too much. So there's probably some corrosion there, I assume. I've pulled apart what they call the junction box, which is really just the fuse / relay box. And as you can see, I haven't pulled it apart all the way, but already we have some corrosion, don't we? Poor connections, lots of corrosion, what a headache. As you can see in comparison where it was before, it's a lot healthier, there's a lot less corrosion and there'll be better contact continuity through. But as I mentioned, the main things will be our terminals here. They're the ones I need to focus on to make sure that there's no corrosion where my connectors actually fit onto. So I'm pretty happy with the results. I've cleaned up all the terminals on these, I guess you could say circuit boards, or part of the fuse box assembly or power distribution assembly. I've also cleaned up the corrosion that was stuck on the plastic on some of these covers, etc. All that's required now is just to pop it back together and stick it on the bike, and hopefully we can get rid of some of those voltage drops that we had before. It's also important to keep in mind that if you've cleaned up all your connectors down here, it makes sense that if there's any corrosion on the fuses themselves, the little legs, you need to clean them up and make sure that there's good continuity between the male section of the fuse and the female section of the connector itself. Before you assemble your power distribution block back onto all the connectors, etc., make sure there's no corrosion inside. I've checked all these, they seem alright. I've decided to replace the starter relay. The one that was there had some staining on it, so I wasn't happy with that, and for the price of a relay you might as well stick in a new one, just to make sure that we don't have any more continuity issues anywhere along the starter circuit. I was doing a further wiggle test, particularly around the headstock area, because I wasn't thoroughly convinced that these are all in good condition. As I was wiggling it, this particular one sort of didn't feel right to me. So I pulled it apart to have a look. In actual fact, it fell apart without too much effort. If we have a look inside, you can see that the connectors aren't that fantastic, but you know, I'm not thoroughly convinced that that's the fault. So what I did was put it back together, turn on the ignition, and it starts perfect. And I thought, well, there must be a reason for it. So let's go across to, let's have a look at the colours of them first and see what they actually are. Yellow, green and green. So let's have a look at the wiring diagram and find out exactly what that wire does. If we have a look at the wiring diagram, we can see that those two wires, the yellow-green wire and green wire, come into the clutch switch. This in turn, if we follow that up, it goes up to our power distribution box. We need to check the clutch switch and make sure it's operational. So wherever possible, make sure you do yourself a voltage drop test. They are far more accurate than a resistance check. So in this particular case, I have the ignition turned on, and as you can see, I've just gone into the actual switch itself with my multimeter connections, just back probing with my pins. So if I set my multimeter here so that you can see it, let's have a look. There we go. Okay, so at the moment with the ignition turned on, it's got good continuity, hasn't it? But if I do nothing but shift the lever, have a look at that. It's changing backwards and forwards. I'm just shifting the lever a tiny bit. That is where we have a massive voltage drop there. So the switch has got a bit of an issue there. Let me show you what I'm doing. The only movement I'm doing is this. I'm just going that much movement. Okay, and that's where I'm getting that reading. I guess the easiest way is just to turn it here, or crank it, cranks it, come back a bit. No cranking. and I'm pushing hard against the lever, as you can see, pushing it that way. Comes and goes. If you had your hand on the clutch, it wouldn't start at all for some reason. I have no idea why. Just to prove the point, all I've done is just bypass that wire, or the switch itself, with a piece of wire and a couple of connectors, and every time it'll start without fail. In fact, turn my ignition on, perfect every single time. So talk about a combination of faults, hey? So I'll have to ring the customer and find out exactly what he wants done. I've spoken to the customer about the clutch switch. He's taken the option of just bypassing the switch here, and that should get the bike up and running. I have told him that it's a safety switch, but he said that he only ever starts it in neutral. So that's up to him. I'll put it on the invoice, of course. So I've made up a little bypass wire, as you can see here, and I'll just pop that in there now. That appears to be working now. Like I said, I'm going to put it through some pretty severe testing, and it's pretty important, as you might note, that a wiggle test doesn't just include wires and connectors. It can include switches and levers and all sorts of things to try and find the fault. This one's been a bit of a curly one because there's had so many different faults, but at least I think I'm on the tail end of it now. I might even wrap some tape around this connection here just to make sure that I don't have any trouble with that bypass wire coming out. Well, you'd have to agree this has been quite a ride, both figuratively and now literally. We had problems with corrosion, poor terminal retention, connectors that had fallen apart, a relay that was a bit iffy, and finally a dodgy clutch switch. So hopefully it's all good. I'm just about to take it for a road test, which is pretty much the hardest part of the job, but never mind, somebody's got to do it. If you guys haven't, please subscribe to my channel. Feel free to give it a like, and don't forget to comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, so until next time guys, we'll catch you later.
Shut up and sit down.